Welcome to the Beyond the Battlefield podcast, the exclusive podcast of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research, where we provide access to insights on the intersection of science and service. Each week, we will meet with leading researchers and people with lived experience to discuss issues affecting military, veterans, and families. Join us as we unpack the findings to bridge the gap between military, veteran, and family health research and real-world impact. In today's episode, we sit down with Dr. Heidi Cramm and Professor Nicola Fear to discuss the evolution of family research, the lifestyle dimensions impacting families, and highlight some of the important topics we will cover in the series. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. As you listen to the podcast, feel free to leave feedback in the comments section below. Did you learn something new? Do you have something to share about the topics we discussed today? At the end of the podcast, we will also invite you to complete a short survey by clicking the survey link in the podcast description section. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. Dr. Heidi Cramm is a professor in the School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's University and research lead for the Family Matters Research Group. Dr. Cramm's research is dedicated to the mental health and well-being of defense and public safety families, working in close collaboration with the Garnet Families Network, a research ecosystem for defense and public safety families. She is also the Families Advisor for the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research. Professor Nicola Fear joined the Academic Department of Military Mental Health at King's College London in 2004. She also worked as an epidemiologist for the Leukemia Research Fund and the UK Ministry of Defence. Since 2011, Professor Fear has been director of the King's Centre of Military Health Research alongside Professor Sir Simon Wesley. In 2014, King's College London awarded Professor Fear a chair in epidemiology. She is one of the principal investigators on the CIMVHR military cohort study and leads several studies looking at the impact of military service on families. Professor Fear obtained a Bachelor of Science Honours degree in pharmacology from King's College London before training as an epidemiologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the University of Oxford. Hello, Dr. Cramm and Professor Fear. We are very excited to have you today on the Beyond the Battlefield podcast for our very first episode. As you know, this is an entire series that's dedicated to military, veteran, and public safety families and family research at large. To get us started, can you touch on why we should have a series dedicated to families and why family research is so important?
Thanks so much for having us. Families really serve alongside. And so we've moved the discourse from this idea that families are in the background to really looking at families as an integral part of the system that allows these jobs to be sustained. So they really become increasingly relevant for recruitment and retention because there's a lot of work that happens home for people to be able to go and do these 24/7 high-risk jobs.
And I think I'd come back to you, Nick, and almost say, well, why shouldn't we have a special issue on families? We all know ourselves that families are important to us individually. And, why is it any different for the occupational groups that we're interested in talking about today? So our service personnel, our veterans, and our emergency responders, what's happening to them in their occupation affects them directly. And then that can impact their families as well through those consequences.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we know that where we're at right now with family research has come a long way, and there's a bit of a historical context to this. So how has family research evolved over the years?
When I started at King's, which is nearly 20 years ago now, we did no research on families. And that's families under the umbrella that we're talking about today. So the armed forces community and emergency responders. All of our research was focused on the needs of the serving person. And that was around the time that we were involved in the conflict in Iraq. And so understandably so, people were interested in the consequences of that deployment on the individuals who served there. As time went, people became more interested in how those individuals transitioned into civilian life. And through the work that we were doing at King's, we were hearing from service personnel and veterans themselves that, they may have done and seen some pretty horrific and traumatic things, but if their family was supporting them and their family was doing well, and that individual themselves was generally doing okay. And that was really for us, from the UK perspective, was, well, now we need to ask the families because we all experience things differently. And so how are the family experiencing the consequences of, in our case, military service and deployment themselves? How are they supporting their loved one, but also what are the needs of those family members, and how can we make sure that as a nation that we identify those needs and support them appropriately?
And one thing that has been touched on with what you said there, Professor Fear, and I think we'll touch on in this series too, is understanding families in their own right. So I think a lot of people who might be listening or think about family research, think about how do they support the serving member? But these are individuals in their own right. Has research evolved in that way to make sure that we're understanding their needs, their challenges, and how they're impacted by service?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, when family research, again, in this context started, it was very much, let's ask the service person or the veteran how their family are doing and what the needs of those family members are. Whereas, really, we need to ask those family members directly. And thankfully, we are now getting the voice of the family member, not only spouses and partners, but also children, parents, to really understand what are their needs. And I think, we need to ask that individual and not rely on a third party to report on the needs of their family members.
An interesting question that has come up at times in the field is who are family members and what do they look like? And I know that's something that we'll touch on in this series, but who are family members is a big question that I have. Is it just romantic partners and spouses, as caregivers, children? Luckily, we touch on these topics in the series, but can you provide an understanding about who family members are?
Families, really, it depends on who you ask, right? So the short answer is it depends. And really, if you're looking at things related to policy, if you're looking at things related to programming, the definition of family becomes more or less restrictive, often when there is eligibility for benefits, things where there is a cost, things where there is a broader kind of conceptualization of family. We see it being more self-defined. Who do you consider family? But really looking beyond this kind of heteronormative idea that there's the man who's serving, who's married to a woman, and, they have 2.3 kids, and depending what country you're in, a different kind of dog. So that's kind of what we see. And we've joked about that over the years because it's really that's what families see as a representation in a lot of the images about what military families look like. And so what we see is a very intentional broadening of that awareness around program inclusion and around research and what kind of families are we talking about. And so we were really excited in the special issue to be able to really showcase the voices of individuals within families and different kinds of families and identify gaps and issues related to low representation. Military families, in a lot of ways, are representative of the broader communities. So when we see the demographic shift, where in Canada right now we have the youngest, most single representation of active force that we've seen previously. So if you are in your 20s, then the odds are that your kind of next of kin, the people upon which you rely, are more likely to be your siblings and your parent than they are necessarily like a romantic partner or a spouse. So, but that depends on where you are and some of those eligibility for benefit. There are differences that we're seeing shifting and a broadening to include different voices. And as Nicola had said, having representation from the experience of the people within those families rather than the proxy reliant on the person who is serving within those families gives us a different, more nuanced, richer understanding.
And just to build on Heidi's points, and you asked Nick, kind of how families research has evolved over time. If you look back to some of the early work that was done, most of it was done in the US, and most of it was done, as Heidi said, the male was in the military. He was married to a woman. They had their obligatory 2 children and a dog of some variety. Now, we've kind of recognized that that's not the more modern view of families. And so we, as researchers, we're opening our doors to a more diverse community. We're getting there. I'd say that we're not there yet. I think some of that is, as Heidi alluded to, these families don't necessarily see themselves represented in research. So why are they going to come forward? Because, in the past, they look and say, well, we're not that traditional married with 2 kids. And so what's in it for us? And why should we become involved? So I think for us as researchers, we do need to get better at making our research more inclusive and more accessible to these other groups.
Thank you both for that. It sounds to me like the research is really evolving and taking a bit of I don't want to say, maybe a bit more broader, diverse lens on who is a family member. Are programs and services doing that as well? It sounds like there's this changing view, evolving view within military research and family research, but what about programs, services that they can access?
I do see that there's an expansion and everyone's doing their best to be as responsive to the broadest community with the scarcity of resources that everyone's also experiencing. So I think nothing's perfect, but I think there is certainly a shift in this direction.
Yeah, and I would support that from the UK perspective. I mean, sometimes there has to be eligibility criteria because of the nature of what the service is providing or the resources that are available. But I think there's a general kind of move that, yes, we need to recognise that families come in all shapes and sizes, and services, programmes, etc. need to reflect that.
And maybe going back to one of the questions on why is family research so important, I think this kind of is a small piece of that too, right? There's the understanding the needs and supports for the family members, but then there's having that research to provide those supports as well and making sure that they become common practice in the future and it continues to evolve. Dr. Cramm, I will direct this one directly to you. I've heard you talk, I've seen your work talking about lifestyle dimensions. Can you explain what this means for listeners?
So this is work that Nicola's been involved in as well, and quite a group of us trying to really bring us into this next kind of phase of families research. So there's not that many of us doing families research in these occupational groups internationally. So, in trying to evolve kind of how do we use the research that's there and be able to apply it to some of these kind of diverse families, different cultural contexts, like how do we understand the forces that are impacting families? We started with the kind of supposition that there's this trifecta of issues that we've heard face military families for a long time. So there's risk, there's parental separation, and there's mobility. So there's this triad. So we're like, okay, so if we start with those and we look at the other folks, like people who are no longer serving in terms of, veterans or public safety personnel or emergency responders, depending on what country you're in and who's in those groups, you look at what's all the research tell us about what family lifestyles are like for these occupational groups that might be different or distinct from other occupational groups. And what we found was that when you start to do this kind of cross comparison and you do the synthesis of all the research that's available for these groups, you start to see 4 things shake up. So one is risk. And predominantly what we know historically about military, veteran, and public safety families relates to risk, the impact of the job on the family. So that's what we see. And there are real risks to these jobs. These are things that can spill over into the family. If you have post-traumatic stress, what does that do in terms of communication in family, for example? So we feel like, okay, risk is there. People get the risk. But there's more than risk. And this is where the dimensions help us see the other complexities that are happening within family systems and help us target things. Because if the risk is there, then how do we actually mitigate the impact of risk by building up some of the other dimensional things that we can actually impact? So one of those things is logistics. These jobs, there's a dynamic impact of non-standard work. So if you're in the military, you might have a go bag and you might have 24 hours to deploy. The family just has to adapt. Then whoever's left behind has to adapt. If you are, a firefighter like my family, when my husband goes to work, it's for 24 hours every time he goes. We just have to adapt as if he's not here, because he is not here. He's essentially intermittently, persistently deployed. So you've got those logistics. Within those logistics, you have, especially with the cost of living that's happening everywhere, most people, if you have 2 people in the home now, you have both of them working. If you have a couple, that couple, they're both working outside the home. So now you have a natural kind of work-family integration tension of how do you balance it all? Because it gets harder when you have 2 people working. And if you add dependent care, elder, child, whomever. But then you get into these identity issues. We know that for military families, there can be a protective identity when you feel like you are doing something that contributes to a greater meaning. But those identities can work against us when we feel like we're not seen in the broader community or we feel out of sync with the broader community. If there's hostilities towards your community, say with police families, and that really does impact families when they see their loved one go out and you don't know what's going to happen to them on shift and you don't feel that kind of social capital. And then you have mobility, which for some of these families is an obligation, part of the job. And for other families, it becomes a constraint and they can't move because of the nature of those jobs. So we have risks, identities, mobility, and logistics, these 4-dimensional issues. People hear, oh, well, I've got that one or I've got that one. And many jobs have 1 or 2 of them. But what happens with these families is they have all 4 of them stacked together in a way that the weight of all 4 is compounded and gets more complex. And that dimensions weigh on those families, but weigh on them differently over the life course of the families. And that's Another part that we're really excited about in this next phase of research, I think, is to be able to better understand what happens to families from a life course perspective, because so much of the research has focused on that particular iteration of the family where it's the man married to a civilian woman, not dual service, which we are increasingly seeing, with kids. So that's a particular slice of a particular kind of family at a particular point in their life course. So we're excited about those things. The other things that the dimension gives us is that we get to see what we don't know. So what we see with identities is that we don't know very much about veteran families and what their sense of identity is in relation to the military service. We know that people who have struggles with using or identifying with the concept of being a veteran. So what does that mean for the family? And where do they fit in the broader civilian community now that they've done this 10, 12, 25 years within a military? So I think the dimensions really give us some incredibly important conceptual anchors that help us see next steps, reveal gaps, and also bring clarity to the weight and the complexity that these families are managing.
If I can just jump in on Heidi's point around life course, I think that's so important. We're developing this area of research all the time. We're good at kind of looking almost like at snapshots in time, so we can tell you about what that family looks like, what the needs of that family might be, and what support they may require at that point in time. But that doesn't mean that in a year's time, those needs are going to be the same. It doesn't mean that that family will look the same. Families grow, shrink, people join. Unfortunately, people pass away. And so, again, there's that constant changing of family. There's constant changing of our own health and well-being. So we can do all of this research, but if we're only keep looking at single snapshots in time, we can only ever tell you what we know at that one point. So it is really important that we continue to look at families and we continue to see how their needs evolve over time.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So thank you for that overview. So what I'm hearing, there's dimensions. We have risk, mobility, logistics, and identities. Every family is going to have their own individual, unique experience. But it is that these 4 dimensions are mutually felt by almost all families, or maybe even all families. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the nice thing that we've seen through the work is by being able to name them and frame them, then people see it as they see that they are part of a collective phenomenon. So other families in these occupational groups get it because they live it too. So when you move beyond the individual occupations, the sectors or the service elements, you start to see, like, I have a lot in common with a police family, with a military family, because I come from a fire family. And that gives us power in amplifying our effort, because then we don't have to say, okay, we need 20 researchers to do this in 20 different service elements. Let's look at the experience. One of the things that's also important is that when we look at that as a phenomenon, it makes it so that it validates people who are experiencing these issues at an individual level, because ultimately every family is experiencing all 4 of these in some fashion all the time. But because you're experiencing them individually, it feels like an individual experience. When we look at it as a collective experience, this collective phenomenon, it really does give us some important anchors for us to target research and next steps around filling some of these gaps.
I think Heidi's right. We can look across like a much broader spectrum of occupational groups. It's still really important that we pick up on the nuances of those different occupations. Even within the military, there are different services, and then within each service, there are different roles and responsibilities. So it's great that we can have a collective voice to this, but it's really important that our research reflects some of these unique aspects of those occupational groups. They're different family groups, and also there are inevitably going to be national and international differences that we want to reflect in the research. I mean, we've come on leaps and bounds over the last 20 years that I've been involved in military health research.
So this framework is flexible. It also provides support and pillars in a sense. One thing, Dr. Cramm, you mentioned is that some occupations might experience 1 or 2 of the risk, mobility, logistics, and identities. But then there's occupations that are similar and they might experience all 4. And we could take a broader lens as well. So military and public safety or emergency responder families, or does it even extend beyond that?
So when we started sharing this framework out, we know that healthcare workers, for example, or seafarers are going to experience a lot of the same, but they might experience 2 or 3, but maybe not all 4. So this is where the framework does have potential for extension to other occupational groups. But what we wanted to do is create that framework so that we have the conceptual clarity, and then it has that flexibility to be responsive to a collection of families in a particular context, which is very important, as Nicola has raised.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it's important to recognize these areas where families have similarities and challenges and identity. Well, I don't want to say identities because that is one of the pillars, but they have a lot of similarities and challenges and supports and needs, but also, as Nicola recommended and suggested, not necessarily assuming everyone fits within that mold of all these exact pieces either, right? Which is so important. And Dr. Cramm, one thing you mentioned is it's interesting how families feel alone. Those weren't your exact words, but oftentimes when things are challenging, you feel like it's isolating and you're the only one experiencing it. But being able to recognize that families do have some similarities, there's other people out there and there's other supports out there because of a framework like this.
Absolutely. So it creates the potential for more connection and for more impact for resources and programs.
Now, one thing I want to touch on is, luckily, a lot of these conversations, we've brought on guests onto this podcast series from Canada, from the UK, from Australia, expertise in different areas of family research. So we will be touching on a lot of these points that we've discussed today as the series goes on, which is very exciting. One of the last questions, I can't believe we're almost out of time already, and these conversations are so filled with so much information and they could go on forever. But where do we currently see gaps in family research? So we've come a long way from my understanding, but I'm imagining we're not putting this together and stopping here. There's growth and there's areas to expand to. Any ideas that you could provide on some gaps in the literature or where you're hoping family research goes over the next 20 years?
How long have you got?
Well, I got a little while, yeah. We can cut out my whole talking bits of this episode. We have lots of time.
So I think if I start and then I'll hand over to Heidi. Yes, we've made great strides, and I think that progress has increased in pace. Heidi's been fantastic, pulling the whole community, not just in Canada, but internationally, in the right direction. So we're moving forward at pace with this, but there are still groups that we are missing that are not represented in our research. So we need to ensure that we are including all of those different voices and experiences. I think the piece that we've discussed around life course, we need to get better at developing these kind of cohorts of families, and that cohort will change as people leave and new families join, but we need to follow cohorts of families up over time. And I think as a research community, we need to get better at doing that translation of what do these research results mean for the families themselves, for the services, for the support programs, etc. And how can we ensure that what services and programs are out there are based on the best evidence that's available. So for me, they're, I suppose, the big kind of buckets of things that I feel we need to move forward with over the next few years.
More research. Yes, there's definitely more research. We also need more researchers.
Yeah.
So we need people,
True.
We need the families, and developing the trust, the long-term trust with the families themselves, so that they will not only engage with the research, but to create a research ecosystem of families and those who study, serve, and support them, so that we can collectively identify what those priorities are and figure out, well, who knows something within this space, and how do we then activate, catalyze towards something that actually has impact. And that is the vision for our kind of international partnership going forward, is to be able to look at how to do that in a collaborative, collective impact network. Nicola says we're at pace. I would say we're at a clip. Families is having a moment within these occupational groups, and that there is a demand that is increasing for, well, what do we do about families? So we've moved from this space of like, and families, don't forget about us, to what about the families? And like, let's go. And in some ways now we have to be like, hold on. You know, we don't want to get into a de-implementation problem where things go too quickly before we have it solid and grounded. And that's why the framework really helps us ground what we do know, what we don't know, and to put boundaries and scope around that. There's so much that needs to be done and that will be done, but we need to build international cohorts of researchers as well, and families who really want to work with us to inform what that path of priorities is for research.
If I could add one more thing as well. As researchers, we're very good at looking at the negative. We are very good at telling you what the problems are and what the risk factors are. And that is not always helpful to the community that ultimately we're trying to support. So I think as well, we need to be looking at what are the positive aspects of being a family member of a veteran, a service person, an emergency responder. What can we learn from those families that are doing well and not just coping and surviving, but are thriving? How can we learn from them and take evidence from their experiences to help other families that perhaps aren't doing quite so well? So I do think we need to get the balance a bit more equal between, yes, these are the needs, but also what are the benefits of being part of this community?
I'd like to add on to that, because it's one of these things where so much of what we have seen in terms of research and programming is focused on risk. And so when we start to look at things like mobility, so cost of living, spousal career impact, children's education, like you start to see, we have to understand all those things that are actually potentially more modifiable than the risk. The same thing with the logistics. If we can give people upstream preventative access to mental health and well-being resources and support, then we can keep them doing better to be able to manage their family system before that risk is introduced. Because logistics is what actually grinds people down. And then you have issues related to the identities and people feeling like their experience is part of it. So it's not that they are serving behind, the strength behind the uniform is not something military families want to see. It's like, we serve too. And so having that identity and feeling that sense of connection to the broader community and feeling that they have meaning and purpose and belonging in ensuring our collective safety and security is an important part of the identities as well. So upstream, life course, big picture, and what's modifiable. We need people to do these jobs. So if we're going to have that, then let's think about how to keep these families well, because the work-family tension can become untenable and pull that person out of the job because their family is struck because of the demands of the jobs.
Very well said, both of you. Professor Fear, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'll just
Restraint.
keep adding.
Well, I want to take the time to thank both of you for coming on to the Beyond the Battlefield podcast today. Very excited for this conversation, for the listeners to hear it, and just to be able to be part of this series myself and spend the time chatting with you today. Thank you both for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Cramm and Professor Fear. The conversation makes it clear why research on families is critical, and I'm excited to explore the topics we cover each week in this podcast series. Please continue the conversation with us by following the CIMVHR and the CIMVHR on Facebook and LinkedIn. Now that you've listened to the Beyond the Battlefield podcast, episode 1, we invite you to complete a short survey by clicking on the survey link in the podcast description section below. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. Next week, we have the opportunity to chat with Dr. Lena Tamsito and Dr. Deb Norris. Trust me, you won't want to miss this episode. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. Until next time, take care and stay well. Goodbye for now.